Good morning. Hello. And time for coffee and chat about some machine stuff. Um,
Comments on?
where's comments? Right here? Put comments on. No, that's not it. How do you do this? That one? There we go. Yeah, live chat messages visible. All right, cool. And nothing's coming up. Hello. Hey, man.
You go.
Let me get some coffee in me, and then we'll be able to have a conversation. Um, and while we do that, I'm gonna. What gauge wire used to wrap your coils? 24. I use 24. Some people like to wire like 22 or 23, and that does work. But there's like there's a point where the coils get a little hot if you're using something that's too thin, too thick. It's kind of just like the right balance in relation to the size of the core. I got some wiener dog frames that I'm gonna make for a buddy of mine, so I'm gonna do that while we're talking and hopefully answer some questions for you guys. And if you don't have any questions, well, let's see. Straight away with a question. If you say fucking mouth pussy, it's too early. Maybe we can get some machine. Can you see any machine? Huh? What's that? Vice? Oh, for that? Yeah, but I'm trying to like figure out a way to make this more focused on the machines and less on my face. Let's see. I don't see any questions. Sweet.
Can we borrow your car?
My car?
Yeah, we want to go get coffee.
Yeah. Where are you going?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Down the street.
Yeah.
Am I interrupted this bad time?
That's fine. I mean, we're just live. You should come over and say hi, though, since you're gonna do that.
Hi.
Hold on a second.
Make it a little more fun to
Here's my
watch.
keys.
Dude, you're the best. Over here.
All right, hang on a second. All right, we're gonna try to get some. This is all. All right, let go. Yeah, look at
Boom.
that shit. There we go. I used a piece of tape to hang this iPad.
We used our gimbal. Fucking.
What's a gimbal? Hang on. Where's the chat? Live chat. Let's see. I don't see any. There we go. Okay. Best way to change the throw length effectively. Okay, hang on a second. Hold on. We're gonna do one at a time. Can you guys see each other's questions? Before when tuning them. Okay. Some of this is stuff that was answered in the last live Q&A, but we'll go over it. It's fine. All right. So the first question is, what is the best way to change the throw length effectively? There's a number of things that factor into that. The first thing I would do is just back off the contact screw a little bit. Just turn it out a little bit. And if you find that slows the machine down or makes it run softer, then you have to compensate in other ways, right? So if you you're like, man, I want my throw to be longer. The first thing you think of is, oh, I'm going to take and back the contact screw out, and that's going to create a longer gap or a larger gap between the armature bar and the front coil, right? And obviously it's going to make that longer, but what it does is it throws the timing off from where it was and slows the machine down, usually, or it makes the machine run a little bit softer. Sometimes what you'll find, which is interesting, and I've never figured out why, but when you back out the contact screw a little bit and you increase that gap, it also lowers your amperage. And I don't know why it does that, but it just, sometimes it does. But, so when you back that screw out and you increase that gap and you slow the machine down, it's because you're increasing the time between cycles, right? You need to compensate in another way. Okay, so when we talked previously about speeding the machine up or even slowing it down, you know, when you talk about changing the speed of the machine, you have to look at the width of your springs, the length of your springs, and the thickness of your springs, and else. And maybe you have a liner, and we're back. Okay, sorry guys, that should be better. Is it better now? We had to switch Wi-Fi networks. Okay, are we here? All right, so like I was saying, you know, if you back out that contact screw and you're like, man, all of a sudden this thing is running like a shader, then okay, you have your stroke length set where you need, but you need to speed everything else. You need to figure out a way to speed it up by using other things. So maybe you'll put 6-wrap coils on it. Maybe you'll put a smaller capacitor. You know, if you have a 45 on there and you want to switch it out to a 22, that's one of the things. So you kind of like, you have this list of things to go down, and you know, these are all the variables that determine the speed of the machine. You know, it's your stroke length and your spring thickness and your spring width and your this, you know, the spring length and your you know, the size of the coils and the size of the capacitor and the length of your armature bar and the space between the armature bar and the spring shelf and the weight of the armature bar and all these things, right? So, you know, first thing, back off the contact screw and then start looking at everything else and how those little factors play in to, damn it, man, I'm having a technical morning issue. Let's see. All right, so does that make sense, guys? Is everybody back on now? Let's see. All right. Let's check and see if people are, okay, we're back up and running. Okay, now, the cool thing is this is being recorded, okay? So when you go to watch this again, you know, the first couple of minutes, if you missed anything, it'll all be there, so don't sweat it. It's all recorded and you can have it for life. Okay, so let me see, there we go, there's the chat. Okay, so that was the first question. The second question, what size capacitors would you use and what difference does it make? Again, that's like, it's all personal preference. It's, you know, what are you looking for it to do? If you are like, you're set out, you're like, this is definitely going to be a liner, its whole life. I'm like not worried about like ever making this thing slow down, you know, put a 22 on there. I like to use, for shaders, I like to use these 47s. They're kind of my favorite. Let's see, over here. Let me see if I can find any smaller little guys. Hang on, just bear with me. I gotta find the key to my lockbox here. So, you know, put these wiener dogs together. These have a little, the ones that, when I set them up for liners, they have a 22 UF capacitor, and when I set them up for shaders, they have a 47. And even though the geometry is, the frame geometry is almost the same, and it's just the main difference is where where that upright lives. But that capacitor plays a big role in how those run. Let's see. All right, I'm gonna try to get through all these. Just give me a second here. Are we better? Do we have a better connection now? Back up and running. Perfect. Okay, hang on a second. All right, I'm gonna scroll. I'm scrolling back and looking at the questions. So just give me a second here. All right. Okay. Now, this is the third question. Jesse, can you please talk about stroke length and your preferred way to accurately measure that? And what do you prefer for lining and shading? Nickel, shader, dime, liner. Just kidding. It's really personal preference. It's like, I mean, really what works for you. What helps me determine the stroke length for me is how well the machine speed matches my hand speed. So if I'm lining something and I feel like I'm snagging, or if I feel like it's not putting a line in really deliberately, I look at, how hard the machine is running and how long the stroke is, and, like how much needle travel there is. There's a lot of factors, but it all really comes down to personal preference. And the idea of this workshop isn't to say like this is the way you're supposed to do it. It's this is the way you figure out how you're supposed to do it. This is the way you learn what works for you and how to get what it is you want out of your machines, because you and I run our machines completely differently. I would imagine like we have a completely different way of tattooing. Our hand speed is probably different. We stretch totally different. So it's a matter of figuring out how to make it do what you want. It's not about like make your machines run the way mine run. It's make them run how they run best for you. I hope that makes sense. So I'm not trying to give you a non-answer. I'm just trying to like be real with you. When your machines start to back off over time, what do you look for in tuning them? The first thing, usually what that is, Ian, is just your rear spring relaxing a little bit. And sometimes it's the front spring, but usually it's the rear spring relaxing a little bit. You just got to, most of the time, just throw a little tweak on that, and just a little more tension on your rear spring until it feels right. And also get a look at your contacts and make sure that it's clean. You don't have to file them all the time. Let's see. Which tuning for a liner would you recommend for tight, round needles? Luis, and that's, again, this is just for me. Something like that, smaller stuff like that, I like something that's fast, because a smaller grouping, like really little tight stuff, like, tight threes, tight fives, little stuff like that, they penetrate really easily. Like if you touch the skin with it, it makes a mark, where if you take like an 18 round and you touch the skin with it the same way, it doesn't really leave a mark. It kind of tends to bounce off the skin, because that that surface tension is spread out, right? So when you go to mark somebody with a single or a 3 or a 5, it makes a line, or makes a mark really quickly and really easily. So I like the machine to run fast, so that way I can move my hand fast. For me, it's because of the way my hands move, and sometimes my hands are a little shaky. So if I'm moving my hand quickly, I feel like there's less of a chance for there to be mistakes along the way. Like when I'm dragging that line, I like to move quickly like this, and to achieve the result, to achieve a nice clean line, when moving quickly like that with a small grouping, I like the machine to run fast, so that way the machine can keep up with my hands, and the ink can keep up with the needles. It kind of all factors in. It's kind of a combination. Some people like it slow, and they have the ability to control that needle and make sure that they don't have any skips in the line. But if you watch somebody like Philip Liu line like hair on something, on a dragon, or whatever, with a single, he's moving really, really, really fast. It's like super, super fast, with barely any needle hanging out, and just moving, because there's really less of a chance of there being a wiggle on that line when you move that quickly. Hope that makes sense. Two for a liner. Let's see. Just stop. I don't know if the problem is mine. Let's see. Stop. So what would be the causes for sparking between the contact screw and a spring? Andrew, when you start seeing spark like that, usually it's the capacitor. Usually it's the capacitor starting to go bad, and it's a good indication of it. If you run a machine without a capacitor on it, you can sort of emulate that. A good way to check is to just run the machine and throw a capacitor, like just take a capacitor and touch it along the side of the machine, right? So if, let's see, if you're running the machine, and we're going to pretend that this has a spark. Oh, that's too much. And we're going to pretend this has a big spark on it, and then you take your capacitor and just touch it to your screws like that, and the spark goes away, then that means that it shows you that your capacitor is bad. And if it's not that, then sometimes if you have a steel, like if you have dissimilar metals, or like your if your contact screw is a harder metal, sometimes that'll cause a spark, but usually it's not going to be, because you're using something that's super conductive, like like copper or silver. So typically it's the capacitor. That's where that spark's going to come from. It won't come from coils or anything like that. What would be the cause for sparking? Back up and running. I don't know if I close anything around. How can I tell how many reps they have by measuring the impedance? It wouldn't tell you how many reps they have. It would just tell you if. So what I would do is measure the impedance from a set that have 6 reps or 8 reps. You could take a set that that you are familiar with, that these ones have 8 reps. Measure the impedance on those, and then measure the impedance on the other set. If the impedance is higher, then that means they have more reps. If the impedance is lower, then that means they have less. Now, that's assuming they both have 24 gauge wire on them. Trying to think if there's any another way that I can answer that for you. No, I think that's about it. I will say that a good thing to know is the greater the impedance, the greater chance the machine has of getting warm. Let's see, if your bar's hitting the back spring, if your A-bar's hitting the back spring so slightly, would you shim it? You mean hitting the back coil? If your A-bar is hitting the back coil, is that what you mean? Not dead yet? Would I shim it? I wouldn't shim the back spring. I would take the rear coil off and remove a shim if there is one, and if there's not, just ever so slightly, a little bit at a time, file the top of that back coil. You only need about 5/1000ths of an inch gap back there. So just take a little bit off at a time, very very gently. How do you feel about bending the front of the back spring to create a? Sean, I do that sometimes. Once in a while. I was doing it years ago. It was a trick that I think Dan Gilsdorf showed me that like 20 years ago, and it was sort of like when we were like, man, I want to fucking stop using O-rings, but we hadn't really figured out like the whole idea of there being like little air gaps that create these rattles, so we started doing that little tweak on the front of the rear spring. Aaron still does that. I think, hang on a second. I thought I had some of Aaron's springs here, but I don't. If you look at Aaron Kane's pre-cut springs from Workhorse, they have like a little nub. They're like this tiny little nub on the front of his rear springs that he bends up to create a support for his front springs, and that's because he likes his front springs to be a little bit stiffer. The way he runs his stuff, it's a little I feel like his back off in a different spot than mine do, and I like a lot of that's because of the springs. So if people ever send me Aaron's machines to mess with, if they want them to run more like my stuff, the first thing I do is get rid of that little nub on the rear spring. I'll just even snip that off and gives that front spring a little bit more flex. If they want like more power through the whole stroke. I hope that makes sense. How would you set up your shader for super spicy whips? What does spicy whips mean? I'll get back to that in a second. We're going to get coil top and bottom washers. This is a machine tuning workshop, not machine building, sorry. Have I ever heard of using 100 UF35? Evan, no, I have never heard of that, but I'm sure people have, and it would slow the machine down a little bit. We say the advantages and disadvantages of cutting and using full single piece springs rather than separate front and back. They're just harder to make. Let's see, I'll make one now. I'm gonna put a set of coils on this guy. Let me try to find, hang on a second, I'll be right back. So, at a glance, here's two sets of coils for this wiener dog I'm going to start setting up here in a minute. I'm going to make a pair of them, and if you look at them side by side, the only difference in these, they're both 8 wraps, they're both shorties, they're both 24 gauge wire, but the liner has a smaller capacitor, it's a 22, and the shader has a 47. I want that shader to run noticeably slower, so that's one of the things that I do to work within the geometry that I have on this frame. Right, so I'm going to put these on here, and then I'm going to cut a single piece spring for it. Here's a single piece spring from an old Jensen that's super stiff, and this was from an AC setup, like an animal marker, and it's got like plating on it. It's just fucking super shitty spring. But the advantages of using a single spring, I think for me, the only advantage would be that it doesn't twist when you're putting it together. Maybe if you don't have a spring fixture to keep it straight, and also there's going to be less parts to move around. You know, I guess if it's a simpler assembly, then there's less parts, and then there's less chance of it rattling at all, right? The disadvantages would be if you really like the way your machine runs, but your spring breaks, and you have to cut another one. It's like you're replacing your front spring at the same time. That's probably broken in right to where you want it, and that kind of sucks to have to start all over again. I typically don't use them. Once in a while, if I feel like a machine like can benefit from it, if there's like if the geometry is really wonky, and like I can't fit as much as I want in there, I might use a single, but it's rare. Give me a sec. Pepper shading. Okay, for pepper shading, I mean, for like just the thing about, okay, so Cody, when we talk about pepper shading, we refer to like all the little dots, right? You're like, you're seeing that skip, and that's a desirable effect in like traditional tattooing when you see somebody who's whipping their shading like that, and it's like super dotted, and the further out from the black you are, the further apart the dots are, right? And the way to get that dotted effect, to see more dots, is going to be to have a slower machine, because it's literally like striking the skin like this. Whereas if the machine's faster, We talked before about black and gray machines. When the machine's faster, you're going to see less of that dotting. You're going to see less of that granulated look because the machine's moving faster and it's kind of filling that space, and you're not really you're not stippling as much. When the machine is slower, you're getting a more stippled effect, and you're able to see that more. And setting your machine up to do that just means getting it to hit as hard as you want and as slow as you want, to work with how quickly or how slowly you move your hands. You know, when I shade that way, I give a really, really good stretch on the I like make sure it's stretched really tight, and I make sure that I'm working off just the tips of the needles, and I'm consistently just going in just in front of the solid black, and then pulling it out, kind of going in and then coming out like this, instead of like straight in. It's like this, right? So you're lifting those needles off the skin, and kind of focusing on where the tips strike, and at what speed they're striking, and you can sort of dial that in to suit you best. Let's see. Is there any way to make a liner really fast and hit really hard? Yeah, man. Like that's all this stuff that we're talking about. So conchus, getting that 135 speed is really easy. Getting it to to run like a Rolomatic, up in the 170s, 180s is really easy. It's a very simple formula. You eliminate that rear spring gap, use a really thick spring, use a really wide spring, whatever, lighten the armature bar. That stuff's really easy. Getting that same thing to hit hard and still have that speed is more tricky, and that is why that's why I use those armature bars with the really long nipple and the rubber spacers, because those still have the weight of a standard armature bar, but I'm able to get I'm able to really use the geometry of the frame to get it to hit hard. So it all comes back to which of those variables have you addressed or have you not addressed. Is it running too slow? Then you go through the list of things and you figure out, have I done all these things to make it run faster? Is it running too soft? All right, have I done all these things to make it run harder? Or vice versa, is it running too hard? Okay, have I done all these things that would make it run softer? Right? I hope that makes sense. We're gonna have to make a list or something, I think. When cutting your back springs, depending on the shape desired, depending on the line size, is there a tip for cutting them decently to achieve even shape? I'm not sure what you mean, Andrew. Your back spring, depending on shape desired, depending on line size, is there a tip for cutting them decently to achieve? Andrew, I'm not sure what you're asking. I'm sorry, man. The dot box. I've never used the dot box. I don't know, man. I don't really do stipple tattoos. When you're feeling where a machine gives, how do you change that? If it gives immediately, how to change the springs to make it more consistent? What if it bogs down in the back end? Good question, Sean. That's so right. Let me find a shader. Okay, so this is a machine that, and Sean, you'll appreciate this. Dan Gilsdorf made this for me in '98, and I haven't changed anything. I think last time I messed with it, I think I struck the screw on this, right? Just to relax that rear spring a little bit, but this has had the same feeler gauge stock on it for 20 years. It's never been resprung. And now this, the reason that I don't use this machine anymore is because I've changed the way I tattoo, and I like there to be well, not only have I changed the way I tattoo, but I've learned how to tattoo better over the years. 20 years ago, I didn't quite know as much as what I do now. And you can actually see on this, This has that little spring lift in there that you were asking about before, right? Coincidentally, that was when Dan started doing that. All right, and that's where I got that from, was around this era. And this machine in particular, the reason that I don't use this, and I don't really want to fuck with it because he made this for me a long time ago, and I don't want to redo any of it. The reason that I don't use it is because of where it gives up on the stroke, right? It kind of gives up a little sooner than I want it to. And the reason is because of how thick or how wide that front spring is, and that also that lift on there. So this front spring is really stiff, all right? If we were to take that front spring and cut it a little more narrow, that that give would sort of that give would give. You start losing a bit of that give, and you get more power out of the stroke. And the wider you make that front spring, the more it's going to give. And you can sort of you can adjust where on the stroke it gives by changing the width of that spring. The troubleshooting problem with a machine, maybe a magnetized color, large specks of content. Can you cover any of these, please? Well, we talked about the sparks already. That usually is a capacitor. A magnetized coil, that's when a coil becomes when your coils become magnetized, and it's attributed to a phenomenon called magnetic flux, where your coils they build up magnetism in them, and sometimes that's just due to the material that's used. Sorry, I almost put you in timeout here for some. Sometimes it's just from using it, and I used to when I was tattooing a shit ton, and I was sometimes doing 20 tattoos a day. I literally had a demagnetizer. It was this little pad that I would leave my machines on when I wasn't working with them, because I felt like through the day I noticed that my machines seemed weaker and weaker, and then I'd put them on the demagnetizer and come in the morning, and they were powerful again. The other thing was I would just take a screwdriver or something, just whack the bottom of the frame, and it would literally release that magnetism that builds up. And machine cutting in and out. Usually, when a machine cuts in and out, usually it's your clip cord. The machine, if it's cutting in and out, it's a connection. It's not. It's it has nothing to do with the mechanics of it when it cuts in and out. Most of the time, usually it's the way your clip cord moves. For example, this hole here, it's kind of big for that, right? So if your clip cord's not really strong, and you're moving around and you're tattooing somebody, and it just twists in a weird way, it might lose contact with where it's connected, right? It sits at a weird angle here. This is not ideal because it's not parallel. If this were more like this, it would be less prone to cutting out. There's a lot of things at play. But when a machine's cutting out, the first thing I would do is try somebody else's clipcord. Maybe try your clipcord on a few different machines, see if you can, recreate the problem, and then start looking at your soldered connections and make sure everything's tight. Make sure that you don't have any broken connections. Make sure that everything's tight on the machine, and it's 9 times out of 10 you're going to find that it's not something mechanical. What size are the holes you punch on the springs? They're bigger than the screws. Be able to fine tune the position, isn't it? Yes, conchus. So the punch that I use, I'll measure it to show you. Let's say it's 6 millimeter, but I'll check. Let me find my measured device thingy here. Oh, I got my keys. Just hang on a sec. Bear with me, guys. I was losing all my stuff. Where'd the key go? Is it here? Here it is. All right. I mean. Come here. Bear with me, guys. Oh, no, that's not it. Where the hell is my calculator? I'm looking for my caliper here so I can measure that. I'm pretty sure it's 6 mil. Why is it not here? Pete was in here the other day. I wonder if he moved it. Sorry, guys. Just give me a second here. Bear with me. Oh well, yeah, they're a little bit bigger than the screw hole, or than the screw. The hole's a little bit bigger, and I like it for just to, oh, there it is. All right, cool. Thanks, Alex. Where was it? Oh, by the drill bits. That makes sense. Okay. This punch has a. Let's turn that to millimeters. Just make more sense here. It's not 130 millimeters. Out of your mind. Oh, it's 5. It's 5 mil. Okay. So the hole it makes is 5 mil, and the screw is 4 mil. But it's, I mean, it's actually, it's not mil. I use standard, but I'm just saying that just for simplicity. What are some of the most common causes of chatter in the front spring and how to remedy that? When you say chatter, what do you mean? Do you mean this is for Jesse. Do you mean like noise, or do you mean like running inconsistently? Let's get back to that one, Jesse, and I'm going to go to the next one, and maybe you can let me know what you're talking about in a second. So Sean, yeah, the lift effectively makes the front spring stiffer, which kind of, I guess you could say shorter, yes. It stiffens it, and it makes the machine run a little faster and a little softer. I mean, for large groupings, use a wide back spring, but if you're setting it up for something like a little smaller, you taper the back spring. How do you go about cutting the back spring width? I've gone over that. I went over that in the video, I believe, but let's we'll do it. I'll cut some spring now. Give me a second. I'll grab some. Did I move it? Yeah. So if I'm cutting a tapered rear spring, like I did it in the video, start here down this lower left side and cut up towards the front like that. Here's your front. We'll set that aside. Here's your rear. Now you can get your rear spring out of almost any length of this. You can use the front part of it and have a more narrow tapered. I want you to be able to see this. I'll put it against my shirt. So you if you use the front part of this, it's more narrow tapered. If you use the rear part of it, it's a wider taper. So you can get it out of that same cut, right? And you can increase or decrease that angle depending on what it is you're looking for. If you want to, make the machine run faster, use this section of it, right? But keep in mind that when you use that wider spring, it's going to make it run a little bit softer. However, is this to avoid over tightening or just personal preference? Evan, honestly, like uh, um, the flathead stuff, I use it on machines that I feel are kind of you know a more classic style. I like flathead hardware just because the way it looks. It's not really to avoid over tightening, in my opinion. Like, you know, over tight is when you just make it too hard, to fix the machine. I mean, for me, you really can't make it too tight unless it's just a pain to take the stuff off. There's a reason why screws like this have been developed, these torques. There's a reason why, and it's to make stuff tight. And I like using that stuff when it's a more modern looking thing. But when it's something classic, if I'm trying to like emulate a Paul Rogers or a Mike Malone type of a build, that's why I'll use the flathead stuff. It's not because of a preference in functionality. I will say though that when it comes to more critical components, I'll use a different type of a flathead. So when I put together my armature bar and attach the armature bar, when I put the armatures and springs together, and I attach it to the machine, I like to use these Philister head screws because you can get more torque on those. It's about to fall. You can get more torque on these than you can with these little guys. It's just there's like really not a whole lot of depth to put a screwdriver in there. I do like these wide head ones though, because you can put a wider blade in it and get a little bit more torque. But I typically I'll try to avoid using these on springs and stuff. I have noticed that when I put machines together and it's not quite running right, and it's got flathead coils or flathead screws in the coils, if I take those flathead screws out and then put Torx screws in and tighten it all the way up, I can change the way the machine runs by how tight the coils are sitting. So sometimes I'll get the coils seated with a Torx or an Allen screw, get them like fully pulled against the frame, pull those out, and then replace those Torx screws with flathead screws. Use a lot of flathead screws. Okay. RC adapter take power away from the machine? No, they do not take power away from the machine, and they are a great option. They're awesome, and I wish everyone used them, to be honest. How to get more ink flow for big liners? Something I can change my machines to get more ink flow, maybe more stroke length. To get more ink flow, use, and this is just for me, a bigger tube tip. I've seen people that are using, our Black Claw tubes. We made them oversized on purpose, and it's not to fit a larger needle, it's to allow for more ink to flow. And we've had people write us and say oh, like your 7 tubes are too big for your 7 liners. It's not. I mean, they work fucking awesome. They have that extra room in them to be able to put a ton of ink in that tip and move fast and have super fucking flow. Like, more flow is better, more room is better. A tighter tube tip might give the impression of more control, but it really doesn't. It restricts the amount of flow that you have, and it doesn't really allow for as much capillary action of ink flow from the ink reservoir into the skin. Front spring chatter question. So the irregular movement, rather than real rhythmic and smooth, changes sound a bit kind of smooth and kind of chattering back and forth. I find that that's due. I find that that's due to the little air gaps that we've talked about, where like your spring attaches to the armature bar, and it sits on top of the rear spring, and then maybe the rear spring has like a weird little bend in it that lifts it up, or maybe your washer's not big enough and it's not holding it flat down against the armature bar, and you have these little gaps that get created that kind of create chatter and irregularities, and you want to just make sure everything is tight and that everything is snug and that you can't see any air or any light. You can't see any light between your springs and your armature bar, or any light between your spring and your spring shelf. So like this area here, when you tighten that up, or when you tighten this up, and you hold it up to the light and you look at it, you shouldn't see anything, behind or in front of that screw. And if you do, then that's going to cause chatter. Okay. What's that? What are you doing? What are you doing? What you doing, motherfucker?
Fixing the tape, dude.
No, you're trying to
The fall.
pinch zoom on that motherfucker. Does it really matter what material you shim clothes with? It should be magnetic. I've seen steel and stainless using a dollar bill or something metal. I use, are you talking about like the shims themselves, or you mean just like to kind of mess with the angle? Like for like the shims, yeah, I think, like when you're raising and lowering the coils, trying to keep a consistent flow, of current, when well, no, I shouldn't say that. I think all right, you wouldn't use a brass yoke, right? You wouldn't take a steel frame and put a brass yoke. You wouldn't put a non-ferrous material between ferrous and ferrous, right? You want it to be consistent. You want there to be like ferrous material and ferrous material. And if you have a brass frame like this, and it has that little steel yoke in there, right, you're keeping the ferrous material against ferrous material. If you put brass washers or brass shims between your frame and your coil, you're essentially kind of disrupting that that energy, right? So I would absolutely use steel shims, but if you're just adjusting the angle of your coils and you want it to sit a little more forward or a little to the side, if your frame's a little wonky, that kind of doesn't matter as much, because it's not really the whole like surface under the coil. Like I'll use a tiny piece of a dollar bill, like I have these strips. You can buy bags. That's kind of a neat as my daughter would say, a life hack. Go on eBay and you can buy bags of shredded money, and they're cheap as hell, and you can use these for shims, and one bag will last you your whole life. They have a bag of these at Workhorse that's it's been there forever, and just a pinch of those will last you forever. With feeler stock, do you recommend to keep the stock at the workbench? 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch. That's what I always keep. I make sure that I always have 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch. But I just got some 3/8 kind of recently, and this is 20 thousandths 3/8, and this is sort of, if you watch the videos and pay attention to what we're talking about, you would understand why I would want a 3/8 inch 20 thousandths. If I have a really tight gap, like a super short area, and I want the machine to run fast, that's easy to do, but I still want it to run a little harder. Like if I don't have enough room to make it run as hard as I want with length, then I adjust the width. And this stuff is like, has a nice polished, like a factory edge on it. So I'm not going to run the risk of breaking a spring from cutting something down. So it's like I've got the thickness to speed it up. I've got that short rear gap to speed it up, and then I've got this smaller width to make it hit a little harder. Or you could use it to slow a machine down if you wanted to. It's all about that, compensating from one variable to the next. Right? So hopefully that answers, and I thought there was one that we wanted to get back to. Let's see, I'm scrolling through these now. Let's see, I'm just scrolling back through these. The dot box, no. Kind of back spring, maybe make a lighter hard pepper shading. I think everything's been answered so far. Anything else? Let's see. I want to put this machine together, but the iPad is attached right to where my screws are. Let's see. What was that last one? How to find the right stroke length for maybe a 13 open round liner. Would you prefer a shader machine for lining or a liner machine because the running machine is slower with a longer stroke? Hang on. Let me see if I can understand what you're saying. Right stroke length. Okay. So to find the right stroke length, you use the machine. You tattoo with it. And if it doesn't work, if it's not putting a line in, you fuck with it until it works for you, right? So, if it's snagging the skin or if it's not putting a line in right, then you know you need to make adjustments. Let me see if I can break this down a little bit more for you. A 13 open round liner. 13. I don't know that I've ever fucked with a 13 liner. Let's see. She mean like a 12 hollow? I think maybe you mean a 12 hollow, right? So when I line with a 12 hollow, okay, it requires there's a few things to make that work. You have to really stretch the skin. You have to they're not the easiest needle to use. They work, when you can make them work, they're awesome. When you can't make them work, it's frustrating. And it comes down to a few things. Your stretch, number one, you have to have a really good stretch. Number two, your machine is you want your machine to run a little bit slower than you would normally line with. And I wouldn't say shader, but you're gonna be a little bit slower you're not gonna run like 135. You're gonna be closer to like 115, 110, and you're gonna be about a medium stroke. And a lot of ink. You want as much flow as possible when you're working with that sort of a needle. You want to really use that needle and push that ink. You're skimming the surface with a smaller, sharper grouping. This has that surface tension really spread out. So you have to make it penetrate. You have to force it to do its job. Right, so you would you can't really do that with a short, fast machine. So emery cloth to see here. I seem to be evenly removing material from the coat without changing that pitch. You're not trying to change the pitch with the emery cloth. The emery cloth is not. Don't try to change the pitch with the emery cloth. You are. Let's see. This way. And you don't really want to use the emery cloth. Isn't. Hang on 1 second, Cody. I'll get to your question. What is the best way to use the emery cloth to seat the A-bar at the front coat after shimming? The emery cloth is sort of like your last resort. The emery cloth is like just to see if maybe there's like a little burr or something in there. Maybe just very lightly. You don't really want to. You're not pulling down on that armature bar. Let me find some emery cloth. Hang on a second. So, first off, I don't like to use new emery cloth for this. I like to break it in a little bit so it's not super aggressive. So this is an older one that I've had around for a little bit. Sometimes I'll use this for shaping frames, and then once I've used it for shaping frames, I'll use it to kind of help get rid of some of that chatter. So this machine runs great, so I'm not gonna fuck with it. But this one here isn't so critical, right? So when it's really flat. I don't want to fuck with it too much, but I'll illustrate this for you. So I'm looking at it, and this one actually runs really fucking good. I don't want to fuck with it. Hang on. Let's see.
They won't be able to hear you on the machine.
What's that?
They won't be able to hear you with the machine.
Okay. Yeah, that one runs really well. I don't want to fuck with the way that. Let's see. Right. So let me look and see how flat this guy is. Man, everything I have here is really flat. Hang on. That's really flat too. All right, this is just sort of a junker that's I just started fucking with, so this doesn't matter as much. So when I go to kind of when I pull that front coil with the emery cloth, I don't hold it down very hard. I'm barely putting any pressure on this. I'm like just giving a little tug, just a little bit at a time, very gently, just to see if there's any burrs. Maybe there's just like just a tiny little something. I'm not using that to change the pitch. You know, if the frame is wonky, if your spring shelf is, you know, crooked, or if your maybe your spring's a little twisted, you know, I'll use like a little bit of shim like this to kind of kick it to the side, or if I need to, you know, pitch it to the front, I'll do that. But I don't use the emery cloth to do that. Another trick that I use sometimes, if it's way off, if it's hitting at a wonky angle, you can this is you know, I do this sometimes. I'll take and literally grab a pair of pliers and twist. Let's see if I can. I'll literally twist that armature bar a little bit and put a little bit of an angle on that to help follow that you know, off spring shelf if it needs to happen that way. And sometimes that works. I mean, it's really like kind of a last resort, but you know, if it's way off, you can tweak the rear spring like that. Cody, yeah, we're absolutely doing more videos. There's I can't really let on too much about what's happening, but we're definitely doing some more. And I'm also gonna I'm making some free ones to go along with this stuff. Like, I'm gonna make a couple of supplemental videos for like a single needle liner, like a standalone video on a single needle liner, and a standalone video on like a black and gray shader, that they're going to be about 15 minutes where I just go over you know, the way that I set machines up for black and gray or for singles, and those will be free, and you guys can access those along with this other stuff. And as we have more enrollment periods, so like the next time we do an enrollment period, we'll create new live Q&As that go along with those, and we'll have those available online as well for you guys. So if you once you've enrolled to do this liner shader workshop, any videos that we create that go along with the liner shader workshop are now yours. You get access to those for life, right? If we do a new workshop, like if it's another person doing a machine workshop, it's a separate thing. It'll be a separate cost. But with this liner shader stuff, anything that I make related to this will be included. So there will be a handful more free ones that go along with this stuff for you guys. Why were there so many? Huh. How did you notice that, Sean? Are you talking about all these? Because I'm always messing with different stuff. I've got a grip of motors. Where are they? I had like a pack of motors. You see those really nice Swiss motors? Oh, well, somewhere around here I've got like a rack of these really nice Swiss motors. I'm always fucking with different stuff. This is one that I've been playing with for a little while now, just sort of prototyping different ideas for a way to you know, mess with different rear spring setups. And this is one that's kind of just still in the prototype stage, but it's just fun machine nerd shit. Coil height effect, its performance, i.e. a 1-inch 8-wrap versus a 1.25 Evan, that stuff that's discussed in the videos, but I will just real quickly, the more wire the coil has, the slower the machine's going to be, right? So logic would say that a shorty has less wire, therefore it's going to make it faster. That's the quick answer. All right, we're at an hour now. I'm going to do one more question if you guys have it. If not, I'm going to go get breakfast. I can show you one other thing I'm fucking with. It's kind of neat. Shh, don't tell anyone. All right. Thank you guys. This has been fun. I'm looking forward to the next set of videos, and when we do the subsequent. Oh, hang on. All right, is that a question? Hang on. Last one, Jesse. Oftentimes, when I'm trying to use a flat spring washer, the spring shelf is consistently twisting. Is there a trick to keeping them flush without taking forever? Oh, okay. So you mean like, let me find, like this, right? You mean like this guy here and how it lines up with the spring shelf. Is that what you mean? The trick that I use is, find my screwdriver. So I'm going to loosen this up. Okay, let me find my, I need my hands-free device. Hang on a second. My hands-free device. Okay, so hopefully you can see this. God damn it. Really, dude? I'm just gonna hold it. Piece of shit. All right, so I'm going to loosen this up. Okay, so I didn't build this machine here. This is built by my friend Pete. He uses different stuff than I do. You're trying to like hold this thing and get all tighten all these things up. The first thing, like I said in the video, is get yourself a vise and an alignment tool and get everything all set in there like that, so that way you have a free hand. Then start with, it's kind of difficult to show, so when you go to tighten this, don't start with it here, right? When you go to tighten this up, start with it at a little bit of a kind of a negative, or kind of rotated back a little bit, so that way when you tighten this up and you go clockwise with this screw, it brings the coin with it as you tighten it, right? And then you can sort of push it with your finger as you tighten it up, right? I hope that makes sense. So I'll show it one more time. So kind of start with it a little bit back from where you want it, and then as you tighten this up, spin it with your finger and get it where you want it as it tightens. And the coin rotates with the screw. Does that make sense? Like as you tighten it, the coin moves with it, and then hopefully by the time the screws where you want it, the coin sort of like lines up with it. So you can mess with that a little bit, like loosen the screw up just a little bit, and then tighten it and keep kind of trying that until you get it, get the hang of it, where like as you tighten it, the coin rotates and locks into place as you twist the screw. And that's kind of how I've come to make that work for me. Does that make sense? The springs for workhorse, are they punched or lasered? They are, okay, so they are punched. However, Workhorse is doing some new ones that are neither. They're not punched or lasered. And I don't know, I need to double check on how these are made, but Workhorse is doing these new ones that are really, really strong. And when I say strong, I don't mean stiff. I mean like they're supposed to be unbreakable. And I think they're kind of still in the experimental stage, but they literally cost 5 times more than the other ones that we've been using. But we're sort of just still messing with these now and getting really, really good results. I can't really speak on them just yet, but they're supposed to be pretty fucking incredible. Thank you guys. So just to give you a heads up, when we do the next live Q&As, you guys can actually participate in those as well. Like you can come and ask more questions. When we do the next enrollment for, when we open it up for another 2 weeks for people to sign up for the liner and shader class, you don't need to pay again. You automatically get those live sessions. So next time when we're doing this and I'm answering questions to the next group of people, you guys can come and participate and ask questions that you have, maybe that you've, I've found that as I learn more, I have more questions because I think I learn more about what to ask. I think that knowing what to ask is really more difficult than sometimes than it's like coming up with those questions. Like when you started tattooing and you just watch somebody, like you have no idea what you're supposed to ask them, and then you do a few tattoos and you have more questions, and then you do a few more tattoos and you have even more questions. So as you fuck with your machines more, you're probably going to have more questions, and you'll be welcome to come back and ask those. I hope that makes sense. I need more coffee in me. All right, guys. I'll hope to see you next time. And Sean, you're in town, dude. Let's fucking grab a coffee, or you come to the shop and we'll mess with some machines, dude. You're close by. Like I think your shop is like a mile from my workshop. So don't be a stranger. And that goes for pretty much anyone else. If you guys are in Portland and you want to swing by, you're welcome to come to the workshop and kick it with me while we mess with the machines. The workshop's always open to people. All right, thank you guys. I'll do that. All right, thank you. Thanks a bunch for being here. I'm stoked to be able to do this stuff. I'm stoked to be able to share it, and I'm glad that there are people who give a shit enough to like spend the time and figure out how their machines work. This, I'm not trying to make more machine builders. I'm trying to make better tattooers. I'm trying to make people more comfortable with their stuff so they can be more self-reliant and more self-sufficient, and be able to focus more on their work and spend less time waiting for someone else to fix their things for them. So with that, have an awesome day, and I'll hopefully see you guys as soon as possible. Late.